Lieutenant Walter Lowe felt the 60,000-pound Liberator shudder as the shockwave from the river hit the airframe. Glass from the shattered waist windows whistled through the cabin like shrapnel. Number 2 engine was a plume of fire. He was 21 years old, a veteran of 19 combat missions, and in that instant, he was being thrown from his seat while the world outside turned into a chaotic blur of orange fire and black smoke. He scrambled back into his seat, hands flying over the controls, while his co-pilot, Don McDermott, shouted over the roar of the wind. The flight deck was a gallery of failing needles and warning lights. Below them, the sapphire expanse of the South China Sea looked cold and final. There was no more ground, no more safety, only the vibration of twisted aluminum and the scent of a fuel leak spraying into the slipstream. But the journey that led them to that river began 2 years earlier, on a different coast. In August of 1943, the air at Virginia's Langley Field was thick enough to choke a Pratt & Whitney engine. It was a heavy, stagnant heat that clung to the flight line, smelling of salt spray from the Chesapeake and the omnipresent scent of high-octane gasoline. Colonel Stuart Wright, known to his peers as Stud, stood with his boots planted firmly on the sun-baked concrete, his eyes narrowed against the glare reflecting off the aluminum skins of 10 consolidated B-24 Liberators. These were not the standard bombers the Army Air Forces were churning out by the thousands. Under their bellies, where the ball turret usually retracted, sat a strange, bulging radome that looked like a black blister on the airframe. These were the SB-24s, the vanguard of a top-secret gamble that the brass hoped would break the back of the Japanese Navy in the dark of the South Pacific. Wright felt the crisp edges of the letter in his breast pocket. It was on official headquarters stationery, signed by none less than Commanding General Henry Hap Arnold. That single sheet of paper was a golden ticket, a direct order instructing every command in the Pacific to provide Wright and his hand-picked crews with whatever they needed, fuel, ammunition, or priority clearance, without a single question asked. The weight of that letter was a constant reminder of the gravity of the project. This wasn't just another bombardment squadron. This was the Wright Project, a marriage of military muscle and the cutting-edge microwave search radar developed by the civilian scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The men Wright had selected were as specialized as the electronics they operated. Among them was Captain Franklin Reynolds, a pilot who had the steady hands and cold nerves required for the kind of low-level hunting they were about to undertake. Wright watched as the crews performed their final pre-flight checks. They were a quiet lot, possessing the professional stoicism of men who understood that their lives now depended on vacuum tubes and invisible pulses of energy. They had spent months at Langley training with the 1st Sea Search Attack Group, learning to trust the green glow of the cathode ray tube over their own eyes. The mission was simple in its conception but terrifying in its execution. To fly into the pitch-black night, spend 10 hours or more over the empty ocean, and find targets at distances of 60 or 70 miles before homing in for a precision strike at 1,000 feet. By the time the 10 bombers took to the air, heading west toward the vast expanse of the Pacific, the strategic context of the war was shifting. In the Solomon and Bismarck Islands, the Japanese were relying on the Tokyo Express, fast convoys of destroyers and transports that moved under the cover of darkness to resupply their beleaguered garrisons. The Allied forces were largely blind at night, leaving the Japanese to dominate the sea lanes after the sun went down. Wright knew that if his Snoopers, as they were already being called, could prove the combat effectiveness of their new microwave radar, the night would no longer belong to the Emperor. The journey across the Pacific was a grueling testament to the endurance of the B-24. They flew thousands of miles over an unforgiving blue void, the 4 engines droning a hypnotic rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards of the cockpit. For Wright, the flight was a period of intense reflection. He thought of the laboratories in Cambridge where the SCR-717 Baker radar had been born. He thought of the APQ-5 computer, an electronic brain that would soon be toggling strings of 500-pound bombs with surgical precision. This was a new kind of warfare, one where the slide rule and the oscilloscope were as vital as the machine gun. On the 23rd of August, 1943, the tires of the Wright Project's bombers finally bit into the dirt and crushed coral of Kearney Field on Guadalcanal. As the hatches opened, the scent of Virginia's summer was instantly replaced by the oppressive, cloying stench of the Solomons, a mix of rotting jungle vegetation, stagnant swamp water, and the sharp, acidic tang of low-grade fuel. The heat here was different. It was a wet, living thing that seemed to seep into the marrow of a man's bones. Initially designated as the 394th Bombardment Squadron of the 5th Bomb Group, Wright's men were treated with a mix of curiosity and skepticism by the veteran pilots of the 13th Air Force. To the men who had been slugging it out in the trenches of the sky, these newcomers with their secret black boxes looked like pampered technicians. But Wright didn't care for the optics. He had 3 days to get his men settled before their first combat mission. He walked through the encampment, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the jungle-clad mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the slot, the narrow passage of water where the Japanese moved like ghosts. The atmosphere at Kearney Field was one of restless, mounting tension. The ground crews worked through the night, their flashlights flickering like fireflies as they adjusted the delicate radar antennas and checked the bomb racks. Reynolds and the other pilots spent their time poring over maps, memorizing the jagged coastlines of Bougainville and New Georgia. There was little talk of glory. They spoke in the language of knots, feet, and bearing. They discussed the limitations of the IFF, Identification Friend or Foe systems, and the exact interval of the bomb releases. As the sun set on their third day at Guadalcanal, bathing the palm trees in a bruised violet light, Wright stood by the nose of his lead aircraft. The easy times at Langley Field were a world away, and the theoretical physics of the radiation laboratory were about to be tested against the cold reality of Japanese steel. In his pocket, Arnold's letter was damp with sweat. He looked out at the flight line, where the 10 liberators sat like silent sentinels. In a few hours, they would lift off into a darkness that had, until now, spared the Japanese from the reach of American air power. Wright climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and old canvas wrapping around him. He felt the vibration of the first engine as it coughed into life, a low growl that signaled the end of the beginning. The Snoopers were no longer a project. They were a weapon, and the night was about to become a very dangerous place. The air at Kearney Field on the evening of September 28, 1943, was a heavy, stagnant weight. It was a thick, wet blanket that smelled of decaying palm fronds, damp earth, and the sharp, acidic sting of low-grade aviation fuel. Captain Franklin T. E. Reynolds sat on the edge of a splintered ammunition crate near the flight line, his fingers absently tracing the heavy seams of his flight suit. The sun had long since dipped behind the jagged, jungle-clad peaks of Guadalcanal, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise. In the distance, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of ground crews echoed through the humid dark, the sound of the Wright Project preparing for what everyone was calling the big show. The psychological shadow of the previous weeks hung over the squadron like a toxic fog. Only 28 days had passed since Lieutenant Bob Easterling's aircraft, the Princess Slip, had been claimed by the unforgiving mud and fire of this island. Reynolds could still see the orange bloom of the crash in his mind's eye. 10 men snuffed out in a heartbeat while trying to set their battered bomber down on the dirt strip after a night mission. It had stripped away the last of their Langley Field innocence. The easy times were indeed over. The war had become a personal, intimate struggle against both the Japanese and the very elements they flew through. "Briefings in 5, Cap," a voice broke the silence. It was his radar operator, a man who spent his life hunched over a glowing green scope. He looked pale in the dim light, his eyes reflecting a quiet, professional intensity. Reynolds stood up, feeling the sweat-soaked fabric of his shirt cling to his back. He made his way to the command hut, a low-slung structure of corrugated iron and timber that felt like an oven. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, with a different kind of heat. Colonel Stuart "Stud" Wright stood at the head of a map table, his face etched with the grim lines of a man who carried a letter from General Hap Arnold in his pocket, and the lives of 100 men on his conscience. U.S. Naval Intelligence has handed us the target, Wright began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that demanded total silence. Calm Air Souls just confirmed a major resupply run. The Tokyo Express is coming down the slot. 11 ships in total, fast transports, screened by at least 6 destroyers. They're steaming down from Bougainville through New Georgia Sound, and they think the darkness is their armor. Wright tapped a wooden dowel against the map, marking the passage of water that had become a graveyard for so many. The Snoopers are tagged to find, track, and break them. Reynolds, you'll be taking the lead in the Coral Princess. Your job is to be the eyes for the rest of the pack. If you don't find them, no one does. The details of the mission were a cold catalog of risks. They were to fly at 1,000 feet, a dangerously low altitude for a 60,000-pound bomber in the dead of night. At that height, the ocean was a hungry, invisible maw, and the Japanese anti-aircraft fire, or ACAC, would be point blank. The technical requirements were equally unforgiving. Reynolds had to maintain a steady 135 knots on the bomb run to allow the APQ-5 computer to function. The electronic brain would then take over, toggling a string of 6 500-pound bombs at 75-foot intervals. If the computer glitched, or if the radar operator lost the signal in the C return, they were just a slow-moving target for every Japanese gunner in the Sound. The computer needs a clean run, Wright emphasized, looking Reynolds dead in the eye. 1,000 feet, 135 knots, not an inch or a knot more. If you waver, you miss, and they'll light you up like a Christmas tree. As the briefing broke, the men filtered out into the night in a heavy, contemplative silence. There was no bravado, no rowdy cheering. They moved with the mechanical precision of men who had accepted the odds. Reynolds walked back to the Coral Princess, his mind reciting the technical checklists like a mantra. He found his crew already gathered under the towering silver tail of the Liberator. They were engaged in their own quiet rituals, small, private acts of superstition that kept the dread at bay. His co-pilot was meticulously cleaning his goggles for the 3rd time, while the tail gunner sat on his haunches, staring out at the dark tree line. Reynolds performed his own ritual, a slow, deliberate walk-around of the aircraft. He ran his hand over the cold, riveted skin of the fuselage, feeling the vibration of the ground as other bombers began to cough into life across the field. He stopped at the nose art, the stylized woman of the Coral Princess, and gave the metal a firm, lingering pat. It wasn't about luck. It was about the bond between the men and the machine. Inside the belly of the ship, the radar operator was already warming up the SCR-717 Baker. The faint, high-pitched whine of the electronics was a sound Reynolds had grown to trust more than his own vision. "System is hot, Cap," the operator reported as Reynolds climbed into the cockpit. "Tubes are glowing steady. She's ready to hunt." Reynolds settled into the pilot's seat, the leather worn and smelling of old sweat and hydraulic fluid. He gripped the yoke, feeling the familiar heavy resistance of the control cables. To his left, the co-pilot began the engine start sequence. One by one, the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life, their 1,200 horsepower voices merging into a deafening, rhythmic thunder that shook the very air within the cabin. The smell of exhaust and scorched oil filled the cockpit, a scent that meant they were no longer tethered to the mud of Guadalcanal. He looked out the side window at the dim, blue-filtered flashlights of the ground crew as they pulled the chocks. The Coral Princess began to lumber forward, the 30-ton Predator heading for the runway. As they taxied, the silence between the crew members was absolute. broken only by the necessary barks of the intercom. They were a single, cohesive organism now, focused entirely on the green glow of the radar scope and the needles on the instrument panel. "Coral Princess to tower, requesting takeoff clearance," Reynolds said, his voice flat and professional. "Roger, Coral Princess. You are cleared for the slot. Good hunting." Reynolds pushed the throttles forward, feeling the surge of power as the four engines screamed at full manifold pressure. The bomber gathered speed, the dark trees of the jungle blurring into a solid wall of black. With a final heavy tug on the yoke, the Coral Princess leaped from the dirt, the vibration of the runway replaced by the smooth, terrifying lift of the night air. They were airborne, climbing into a void where the horizon didn't exist, heading toward a fight where the only thing they could trust was the invisible pulse of the microwave beam and the cold certainty of the electronic eye. The big show had begun, and as they leveled off at 1,000 feet, the hunt for the Tokyo Express was finally on. The darkness beyond the plexiglass of the Coral Princess was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical, suffocating weight that seemed to press against the aluminum skin of the B-24 Liberator. Captain Franklin T.E. Reynolds sat encased in the mechanical symphony of four 1,200-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines, a grinding, hypnotic roar that served as the only heartbeat in a sensory void. Beneath his boots, the airframe vibrated with a rhythmic intensity, and the cockpit smelled of ozone from the radio racks, stale sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of hydraulic fluid. They were flying through a sea of ink over New Georgia Sound, the infamous stretch of water the men of the South Pacific simply called the slot. "Target acquisition," the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and clinical, cutting through the engine drone. "Range 50 miles. Bearing 320. Account 11 distinct pips." Reynolds felt a jolt of adrenaline that made his fingertips tingle inside his flight gloves. On the round cathode ray tube of the SCR-717 Baker radar in the back of the ship, the world was being reborn in electric green. The pulses of microwave energy were screaming out into the night, striking the steel hulls of a Japanese resupply convoy and bouncing back to create a ghost map for the Snoopers. To the uninitiated, the scope was a mess of static. To the operator, it was a tactical grid revealing a bevy of fast transports and at least half a dozen destroyers steaming south. "Course correction, 5 degrees port," the operator commanded. Reynolds nudged the heavy yoke, the Coral Princess responding with the lumbering grace of a 30-ton predator. He began the descent, pushing the nose down until the altimeter needles began their slow, counterclockwise dance. They were leaving the safety of the clouds and heading for the deck. 2,000 feet. 1,500. "Holding at 1,000 feet, Reynolds reported, his voice flat with professional stoicism. At 1,000 feet, the ocean was an invisible maw just beneath them. A single downdraft or a momentary lapse in concentration would send the Liberator cartwheeling into the black swells before anyone could scream. But the low-altitude bombing run demanded it. To use the APQ-5 computer, the electronic brain that would walk their bombs across a moving deck, they had to be close enough to taste the salt spray. "I have the largest signal," the operator said, his voice tightening. "A cargo vessel, center of the pack. She's a fat one, Captain. Switching to computer control. Level her off. 135 knots. Not a knot more, not a knot less." Reynolds fought the throttles, balancing the manifold pressure to keep the heavy bomber at exactly 135 knots. The air was turbulent, the plane bucking like a frightened horse, but he kept the needles centered. He was no longer a pilot. He was a component of a high-tech machine, a chauffeur for the APQ-5. "Bomb bay doors coming open," the co-pilot announced. The heavy doors groaned as they slid into the slipstream, the increased drag causing the Coral Princess to shudder and groan. Inside the dark belly of the ship, 6 500-pound bombs hung in their racks, waiting for the electronic impulse that would send them into the void. Toggling. Now. The Liberator leaped upward as 3,000 pounds of high explosives were suddenly erased from its weight. 6 bombs, spaced at 75-foot intervals by the computer's precise timing, plummeted into the dark. Reynolds didn't see them go, but he counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The night shattered. A titanic pillar of orange and white fire erupted on the horizon, tearing through the darkness with such violence that it momentarily blinded Reynolds. The cargo vessel had been struck dead center. 2 direct hits and 4 near misses walked across the ship like the footsteps of a giant. Within seconds, a second explosion, likely fuel or ammunition, sent a mushroom-shaped cloud of fire and debris reaching hundreds of feet into the air. The smell of the explosion, a mix of cordite and burning oil, seemed to reach them even at 1,000 feet.
Direct hits!
"She's lit up like a bonfire," the tail gunner screamed over the intercom. The fires were raging out of control, visible for 20 miles, serving as a hellish beacon for the rest of the pack. Reynolds banked the Coral Princess hard to starboard, the airframe groaning as he pulled G's to clear the area before the Japanese gunners could find their range. But the sky was already coming alive. "Ack! 11 o'clock!" The Japanese destroyers had shaken off the shock. Vivid streams of red and gold tracers, the beads of fire that pilots called the flaming onions, began to arc upward. They looked lazy at first, drifting slowly through the dark, before snapping past the cockpit windows with a terrifying whip-like crack. The Japanese were firing by sound, and the silhouette of the bomber against the burning ship. "Uncle's Fury is going in," Reynolds heard Captain John Zinn's voice on the command frequency. Reynolds watched from his orbit as the second snooper dove into the cauldron, but the volume of flak was increasing. The Japanese were putting up a wall of lead. Uncle's Fury dropped its string, but the geysers of white water rose harmlessly behind a frantically maneuvering destroyer. "Devil's Delight rolling in," Major Leo Foster announced. Colonel Wright was in the co-pilot seat, watching his project face its trial by fire. Foster's bombs near missed a destroyer, the concussion nearly swamping the slender ship. Then, the friction of war took hold. "This is bums away. I've got a target, but my IFF is screaming." Lieutenant Bob Letty's voice was frantic, his words clipped. "Identification, friend or foe, is signaling a friendly. I'm breaking off. I say again, IFF says it's a U.S. vessel." "Check your gear, bums away," Foster barked. "There are no friendlies in the slot." "I can't take the chance, Major. The pulses are coming back friendly." Reynolds listened as the electronic certainty of the mission began to fray. Lieutenant Ken Brown in Ramp Tramp chimed in, reporting that his own IFF system was sending confusing signals. In the absolute black of the slot, with tracers blinding the pilots and the smoke of the burning cargo ship confusing the radar, the fear of blue on blue killing their own sailors was a paralyzing weight. 2 bombers banked away, their lethal loads still tucked in their bellies, out of a terrifying respect for a malfunctioning piece of vacuum tube circuitry. The chaos intensified as the last 2 bombers, piloted by Lieutenants George Tillinghast and Fred Martis, rolled in on the now scattered ships. "This is Martis. Have them in sight. We're going in," the radio crackled. Reynolds watched the navigation lights of Gremlin's Haven descend into the thickest part of the Japanese fire. The Japanese had found their rhythm, their 5-inch guns and 25mm cannons creating a latticework of death. Martis's Liberator seemed to disappear into a forest of tracers.
Tillinghast followed, his bombs missing a turning transport.
He climbed back toward 10,000 feet, his voice coming through the static of the intercom, heavy with a growing dread. "Martis, this is Tillinghast. I'm clear. Where are you, Fred?" Silence. Reynolds adjusted his headset, his hand trembling slightly despite the adrenaline. "Gremlin's Haven, this is Lead. Report. Martis, do you read?" The only sound in the earphones was the hiss of static and the distant, haunting whine of the engines. Tillinghast began to circle the area, his silver wings occasionally glinting in the dying light of the fire below. He looked for splashes, for flares, for anything that would signal a crew in the water. "I don't see him, Frank," Tillinghast said, his voice small and stripped of its military professionalism. "I don't see any lights. He went into the flak and he didn't come out." The realization hit the squadron like a physical blow. The easy times were over. Just weeks after Easterling's crash, the Snoopers had lost 10 more men to the slot. They had achieved the impossible. They had found the convoy, destroyed its largest ship, and rattled the Imperial Navy's faith in the night. But the price was being tallied in the empty seats of the mess hall. "Heading home," Reynolds whispered into his throat mic. The 3-hour flight back to Kearney Field was a funeral procession. The crew of the Coral Princess sat in a heavy, reflective silence. Reynolds stared at the glowing green needles of the instrument panel, the light reflecting off his goggles. They had proven that the Wright Project worked. They had proven that science could find a needle in a haystack of black ocean. But as he looked out at the empty sky where Gremlin's Haven should have been flying wingmen, he knew that the radar didn't make them gods. It only made them more efficient hunters, and in the South Pacific, the hunters often became the prey. When the tires finally touched the dirt of Guadalcanal, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding into the eastern sky. Reynolds shut down the 4 engines, the sudden silence more deafening than the roar had ever been. He sat in his seat for a long time, the smell of hydraulic fluid and salt air lingering in the cockpit, staring at the empty parking space on the field. The big show was over. The Snoopers had arrived. But as he climbed down the ladder and felt the soft mud of the island beneath his boots, he knew that the night would never be the same again. The night of November 1st, 1943, was an absolute, suffocating void over the churning black of the Solomon Sea. St. George's Channel had become a place where the sky and the water merged into a single, lightless abyss, broken only by the violent, horizontal sheets of a tropical rain squall. Inside the cockpit of the consolidated SB-24 Liberator known as Ramp Tramp, Lieutenant Deward Sumner fought the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The heavy bomber bucked and surged like a frightened animal as it was buffeted by the unseen turbulence of the storm. Every rivet in the airframe seemed to groan under the strain, a metallic, tortured chorus that competed with the rhythmic, 1,000-horsepower roar of the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp metallic tang of sweat. Sumner could barely see the tips of his own wings through the deluge, yet he was not flying blind. In the belly of the aircraft, the retractable radome of the SCR-717 Baker microwave search radar was spinning, its invisible pulses cutting through the rain and the gloom with a clinical, electronic precision. This was the Wright Project's promised land, a world where the weather was an ally and the darkness was a sanctuary, provided the vacuum tubes and the delicate wiring held together. Sumner's task was as vital as it was terrifying. Somewhere below, hidden by the storm and the sea, Admiral Sentaro Omori was leading a powerful Japanese strike force toward Cape Torokina on Bougainville Island. 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers were steaming at full speed to wreak havoc on the 14,000 men of the United States 3rd Marine Division who had splashed ashore only hours earlier. If Omori reached the beachhead, the invasion would turn into a slaughter. The only thing standing between the Marines and the 8-inch guns of the Japanese heavy cruisers was a handful of specialized bombers and the 10 men who flew them. "Contact! Target bearing 340, distance 35 miles. The radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding strained but certain. On the glowing green screen of the radar scope, the world was being rendered in emerald ghostlight. The operator watched as 10 distinct pips of light materialized out of the chaotic green wash of sea return. It was Omori's fleet, a lethal formation cutting through the waves at 30 knots. Sumner felt a jolt of adrenaline that cut through his exhaustion. He immediately keyed his radio, transmitting the course, speed, and composition of the enemy force to Rear Admiral Aaron S. Tip Merrill's task group, which was maneuvering in the darkness to intercept. But as Sumner positioned Ramp Tramp for an attack, the crisis of the night began to manifest not in the sky, but in the mechanical heart of his aircraft. He leveled the plane at 1,000 feet, the ocean invisible below but dangerously close. The radar operator fine-tuned the APQ-5 computer, locking the electronic brain onto the largest signal, the light cruiser Sendai. "Bomb bay doors coming open," Sumner announced, his voice tight. The heavy doors groaned as they slid into the slipstream, the increased drag causing the Liberator to shudder. Sumner waited for the familiar lurch as the 6 500-pound bombs were toggled by the computer. But the lurch never came. He checked his instruments, his heart hammering against his ribs. The computer was sending the signal, but the release mechanism, corroded by the salt air and stressed by the violent maneuvers in the storm, had seized. "Release failure. Resetting for a second run," Sumner barked. He banked the heavy bomber back into the storm, the rain lashing against the plexiglass. He made a second pass, then a third, the Japanese destroyers below now alerted to his presence. Tracers, vivid, glowing beads of red and gold, began to arc upward through the rain, searching for the source of the engine noise. A near miss from a light cruiser's main battery sent a shockwave through the airframe that nearly flipped the bomber. Still, the bombs remained stubbornly tucked in their racks. In his after-action report, Sumner would later note with bitter frustration that the very technology that had allowed him to find the enemy had been betrayed by the simple, ancient failure of a mechanical latch. Despite the failed attack, Sumner's presence was already changing the course of the battle. High on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Haguro, Admiral Omori was a man besieged by ghosts. He could hear the drone of the American engines and see the geysers of water from Sumner's near misses. He realized with a growing sense of dread that he was being tracked. The element of surprise, the only thing that could have guaranteed a Japanese victory at Empress Augusta Bay, had been stripped away by an invisible eye in the sky. Flustered and sensing an alerted Allied force, Omori made a fateful decision. He ordered his troop-laden destroyers to abort their mission and turn back to Rabaul, significantly weakening his strike force before the main engagement had even begun. As Sumner's fuel needles began to drop toward the danger zone, another snooper arrived to take up the mantle. Lieutenant Vince Splain, piloting Devil's Delight, had been patrolling a separate sector of St. George's Channel. His radar was performing exceptionally well that night, picking up Omori's fleet from a staggering distance of 75 miles. Splain closed the gap with predatory intent, his crew working in a synchronized, silent rhythm that only months of secret training could produce. "Sumner's clear. We're taking over the track," Splain reported. For an hour, Devil's Delight circled the Japanese formation like a vulture, radioing updated details to Admiral Merrill. Below them, Merrill's 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers were moving into position, their own radar sets tracking the Japanese and preparing for a devastating torpedo attack. The Snoopers had turned the pitch-black Pacific into a chessboard where only one side could see the pieces. Well after midnight, Splain received permission to mount his own attack. He picked out the strongest radar signature, the flagship Haguro, and began a low-level bombing run. The Liberator descended through the rain, the engines screaming at full combat power. The radar operator stayed glued to the scope, his fingers dancing over the dials of the computer. "Release sequence in 3, 2, 1. Bombs away!" 6 500-pound bombs dropped in a 30-foot interval, release walking right up the side of the heavy cruiser. The impact was spectacular. Even through the deluge of the storm, the crew of Devil's Delight saw the flashes of the explosions as the bombs struck the hull and the water alongside. The Haguro was rocked to its core, the bridge crew rattled by the sudden violent intervention from the darkness. Splain banked away, feeling the concussion of the blast through his seat, but he received no return fire. The Japanese were so confused, so blinded by the rain and the shock of the attack that they couldn't even find their tormentor. The psychological crisis for the Japanese was now absolute. Omori, believing his flagship was under heavy air attack and fearing the approach of American surface ships, reduced speed to assess the damage. His tight formation, already stressed by the weather, lost all cohesion. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that Merrill's cruisers opened fire. The darkness was shattered by the thunder of 6-inch guns as the Americans began their radar-directed slaughter. By 4 in the morning, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay was over. Admiral Omori was limping back to Rabaul with the light cruiser Sendai sunk, one destroyer rammed and lost in the confusion, and several other vessels, including the Haguro, badly damaged. The invasion force had been turned back, and the 14,000 Marines on the beaches of Bougainville were safe. When Splain and Sumner finally touched down at Kearney Field, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to filter through the coconut palms. The crews were silent, their faces masked by a layer of salt and exhaustion. They climbed down from their battered aircraft, their legs heavy and their nerves frayed to the breaking point. They had spent hours at the edge of death, fighting a battle that relied on vacuum tubes and invisible waves, and they had won. A few hours later, a special message arrived from Admiral Thomas Kincaid, addressed to Admiral Halsey at Airsals. It was a simple, 2-word thank you for a splendid night tracking mission. For the men of the Wright Project, those words were a validation of everything they had sacrificed. But the victory was bittersweet. The crisis of the night, the mechanical failures, the near collisions in the storm, and the sheer terror of the low-level runs had left a mark on them all. Sumner stood by his aircraft, his hand resting on the oil-streaked cowling of engine number 2. He looked at the empty parking spaces on the field, thinking of Martis and Easterling, and the men who hadn't come back from missions like this. The Snoopers had become the primary weapon of the South Pacific, the invisible eyes that could break an admiral's will and save a division of Marines. But as the heat of the day began to rise, Sumner knew that the war was only moving faster. The darkness could no longer spare them, and as they moved toward Rabaul and beyond, the price of their electronic sight would only continue to rise. They were no longer just pilots. They were the architects of a new kind of warfare, one where the human element was increasingly intertwined with the cold, unblinking certainty of the machine. And in the silence of the Guadalcanal morning, Sumner wondered how much more of himself he would have to give to the Snooper before the war was through. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had shed its cloak of shadows and stepped into the blistering, unforgiving light of the tropical sun. The 868th Bombardment Squadron had moved its base of operations to Morotai, a rugged island in the Moluccas of the Dutch East Indies. Gone were the ink-black nights of the Solomon Islands, where the Snoopers had first earned their name as invisible ghosts. The mission had changed, the theater had widened, and the men who flew the SB-24 Liberators were becoming masters of a new, brazen kind of daylight hunting. Lieutenant Walter N. Lowe was only 21 years old when he brought his crew to this sweltering outpost in April. Like the other hand-picked pilots of the 868th, he possessed a quiet, professional stoicism that masked the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much sky in too short a time. The squadron was under the command of Major Bayless Harris, a Texan with a steel-trap mind and years of combat experience. Harris was a builder of men and machines. He was pushing the squadron toward a higher operational tempo, demanding longer missions that stretched the limits of the B-24's fuel tanks and the crew's endurance. On a shimmering morning in mid-June 1945, Lowe sat in the cockpit of a Liberator affectionately dubbed Lady Luck II. The air on the Morotai flight line was a thick soup of humidity, smelling of coral dust and high-octane gasoline. Beside him, his co-pilot, Don McDermott, ran through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, each capable of 1,200 horsepower, coughed into life one by one, their collective roar vibrating through the soles of Lowe's flight boots and into his very marrow. The mission was a daylight search for shipping in the Flores Sea, followed by a strike on the Olin Airdrome. It was a long haul, a grueling test of navigation and fuel management. As they lifted off from the dirt strip, the jungle of Moritai fell away, replaced by the vast sapphire expanse of the Molucca Sea. The sky was an endless pale blue dome, and for hours, the only world that existed for the 10-man crew was the vibrating aluminum shell of the bomber and the steady, hypnotic drone of the engines. "Keep a sharp eye on the deck," Lowe commanded through the intercom, his voice flat and steady. "If they're out there, they'll be hugging the coast." In the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese were no longer the aggressors. They were the hunted, hiding their remaining cargo vessels in shallow bays and river mouths. To find them, the Snoopers had to fly low, dangerously low. They were no longer relying solely on the green pulses of the SCR 717 Baker radar. They were using their eyes, scouring the emerald fringes of the islands for any sign of a rusted hull or a smudge of coal smoke. By midday, the Lady Luck II was skimming the whitecaps of the Flores Sea at less than 500 feet. The heat in the cockpit was oppressive, the sun beating through the plexiglass until the metal surfaces were too hot to touch. Lowe felt the sweat stinging his eyes and the weight of the flight suit pulling at his shoulders. Suddenly, the nose gunner's voice crackled in his ears. "Target! 2 o'clock! 3 small merchantmen. Looks like they're trying to make a run for the harbor." Lowe didn't hesitate. He banked the 60,000-pound bomber into a steep, predatory turn. The Lady Luck II was a specialized beast, stripped of unnecessary weight but bristling with 50-caliber machine guns. This was the turning point in the squadron's history, the transition from high-tech night stalking to the raw, violent intimacy of daylight strafing. "Going down to the deck," Lowe said, his knuckles white on the yoke. "Check your stations." The Liberator descended until it was a mere 200 feet above the water. The Japanese sailors on the decks of the cargo vessels became visible, tiny, frantic figures scrambling for cover. The ack-ack fire started almost immediately, vivid beads of light arcing up from the ships. It was a ship-to-airplane shootout, a primitive exchange of lead and fire. Lowe held the plane steady, ignoring the rhythmic thud of rounds hitting the fuselage. The bomber's own guns opened up, a sustained, deafening roar that shook the airframe. The smell of cordite filled the cabin, acrid and sharp. He toggled the release, and 3 500-pound bombs walked across the water, the geysers of the explosions nearly swamping the lead vessel. As they pulled away, banking hard to avoid the jagged cliffs of the coastline, the violence of the encounter began to recede. Lowe looked in his rearview mirror and saw a thick column of black smoke rising from the Flores Sea. It was a successful strike, another notch in the squadron's mounting tally. But the mission wasn't over. They still had to hit Olin Airdrome. By the time they reached the target, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. They swept over the airfield, their bombs cratering the runways to keep the Japanese fighters grounded. As they turned back toward the sea, the sky was a bruised purple, and the silence after the storm began to settle over the crew. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the strafing runs evaporated, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion. The return flight was a different kind of tension. They were hundreds of miles from Moritai, and the fuel needles were hovering dangerously close to the red. "Number 3 engine is running hot," McDermott reported, his voice tight. "We're burning more than we calculated, Cap." Lowe looked out at the vast, darkening ocean. The transition from the chaos of battle to the quiet, desperate struggle for survival was a familiar one. He ordered the engineers to lean out the fuel mixture until the engines were barely more than a whisper. The cabin was silent, the crew members lost in their own thoughts, staring out into the twilight. They were flying a solid airplane, as the men called the Lady Luck II. She had 18 missions to her credit and had never failed to bring her boys home. Lowe felt a strange, stoic affection for the vibrating metal around him. It was more than a machine. It was a sanctuary. Hours passed in a meditative haze. The moon rose, casting a silver path across the water. The fear of the Japanese had been replaced by the fear of the void, of the engines coughing and dying over an empty sea. But as the familiar silhouette of Morotai finally appeared through the haze, the tension broke, replaced by a deep, weary relief. They approached the field with 2 engines feathered to conserve the last drops of gasoline. The wheels touched the dirt of Kearney Field with a gentle thump, and as the Lady Luck II taxied to its parking spot on the flight line, the 4 engines finally went silent. The quiet that followed was deafening. Lowe sat in his seat for a long time, his hands still trembling slightly from the hours of holding the yoke. He looked at McDermott and nodded. No words were needed. They had survived another day in a war that felt like it would never end. As they climbed down the ladder, the tropical night air was cool against their sweat-soaked faces. The ground crews were already moving in, their flashlights flickering like fireflies in the dark. Major Harris was there, waiting for the mission report. He looked at the hold wings and the oil-streaked engines and simply said, "Good work, Lowe. Get some rack time." Walking back to the barracks, Lowe felt the weight of the coming months. The squadron was preparing to move north to Okinawa to join the final campaign against the Japanese home islands. The hunting would only get more intense, and the price of their electronic sight would only rise. But as he looked up at the stars, he knew the situation was changing. The Snoopers were no longer just a project. They were a force that had turned the tide. They had mastered the night, and now they had conquered the day. As he reached his cot and fell into a dreamless sleep, the last thing Walter Lowe heard was the distant, rhythmic thrum of another liberator taking off, heading back into the vast blue silence to hunt the shadows that remained. The sun over the Bassac River on the 23rd of July, 1945, was a white-hot hammer, beating against the plexiglass of the cockpit until the air inside smelled of scorched dust and ionized sweat. Lieutenant Walter N. Lowe, 21 years old and a veteran of 19 combat missions, felt the familiar, heavy vibration of aircraft 808 beneath his boots. It was a consolidated SB-24 Liberator, a specialized beast of the 868th Bombardment Squadron, and today it was hunting on the deck. The lush, emerald fringe of French Indochina blurred past the windows as Lowe held the 30-ton bomber at a mere 200 feet above the water, the engines screaming at full combat power. "Target spotted, 12 o'clock, the nose gunner's voice crackled through the intercom, clipped and professional. "Large tug dragging 2 oil barges. She's a fat one, Cap." Lowe didn't hesitate. He adjusted the throttles, the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines responding with a predatory roar. He was no longer the green pilot who had arrived at Morotai in April. He was a component of the Wright Project's lethal legacy. He lined up the run, the Japanese sailors on the tug becoming visible as tiny, frantic shapes scrambling for the cover of their 25mm deck guns. The ack-ack fire started almost immediately, angry, vivid beads of red light arcing up from the riverbanks. "Steady. Steady," Lowe whispered, his knuckles white on the yoke. He toggled the release. 3 500-pound bombs, fused with a 4-second delay to allow the aircraft to clear the blast, plummeted into the center of the barges. Lowe pulled back on the yoke to clear the smoke, but the geometry of survival at 200 feet was unforgiving. The barges didn't just catch fire. They vanished in a titanic orange-white eruption. A pillar of flame and debris tore into the sky, creating a mushroom cloud that reached 1,500 feet in a matter of seconds. The shockwave hit aircraft 808 with the force of a physical blow. The airframe groaned, a sickening, metallic scream of twisting aluminum that vibrated through Lowe's spine. The waist windows were instantly blown out, glass shards whistling through the interior like shrapnel. Lowe was thrown from his seat, hitting the flight deck hard as the world turned into a chaotic blur of smoke and fire. He scrambled back into his seat, his hands flying over the controls. The cockpit was a gallery of failing needles. "Number 2's on fire! Feathering number 2!" his co-pilot, Don McDermott, shouted over the roar of the wind. They managed to extinguish the flames, but the damage was terminal. A fuel leak was spraying a fine, lethal mist into the slipstream, and the airframe was so badly warped that the Liberator was fighting its own weight just to stay level. They were miles out over the open, sapphire emptiness of the South China Sea, and the math of their return was failing.
"Koonsman, do you read?" Lowe keyed his radio, his voice flat with a practiced hollow calm.
"This is 808. We're losing her. We need a sub-rendezvous." Lieutenant George Koonsman, flying alongside in a sister ship, maintained a close formation, his presence the only link between Lowe's crew and the void. He coordinated with a United States Navy submarine in the sector, but as the fuel needles touched the red, the decision was made. One by one, the 10 men of 808 stepped into the slipstream, their parachutes blooming like white flowers against the blue desert of the ocean. Lowe was the last to leave the cockpit, a final look at the scarred metal of the flight deck before the wind took him.
The days that followed were a meditative haze of salt blindness and the crushing silence of the sea. The rescue submarine never found them at the pickup point. When the rescue finally came days later, the tally was a heavy, silent weight. Of the 10 men who had jumped, only 3 remained. 7 of Lowe's brothers had been swallowed by the South China Sea. When Lowe finally returned to the squadron at Morotai, the atmosphere was one of weary professional mourning. The 868th had been pushed to its highest operational tempo of the war, but the cost was being tallied in the empty bunks of the barracks. In July alone, 21 officers and men were missing in action. The roster was reduced to 13 combat-qualified crews and 12 aircraft. There was no ceremony, no loud lamentation. The men simply sat on their cots, cleaning their gear in a heavy, reflective silence that was more deafening than the roar of the engines. "We're moving north," Major Bayless Harris told them during a quiet evening briefing. "Okinawa. The final campaign starts now." The relocation in the final days of July 1945 was a massive mechanical undertaking. The ground crews packed the secret radar units and the APQ-5 computers into crates, while the remaining pilots prepped their battered bombers for the flight toward the Japanese home islands. The Snoopers were being positioned for the planned invasion of Kyushu, a mission everyone assumed would extend into 1946 and claim thousands more lives. But as they settled into the dirt strips of Okinawa in early August, the war abruptly changed its rhythm. The sky over Japan was lit not by the microwave pulses of the Wright Project, but by a new terrifying light that brought the world to a standstill. When the surrender was announced in mid-August, the silence that fell over the squadron was absolute. Lowe stood on the edge of the Okinawa flight line, looking out at the rows of silver B-24s. The Wright Project had been a success. They had mastered the night and conquered the daylight at 200 feet. They had broken the back of the Japanese supply lines from the Solomons to the Bassac River. But as he thought of the 7 men from 808 and the 21 lost in July, the historical significance of their electronic warfare seemed small compared to the physical absence of his friends. The Snoopers had been the architects of a new kind of combat, a world where the machine and the man were inextricably linked by invisible waves of energy. They had been the eyes of the fleet when everyone else was blind. As the engines finally cooled for the last time and the men began the long process of heading home to an America that knew very little of their secret missions, the legacy of the 868th was secure. They were the ghosts who had brought the light of day to the most hidden corners of the empire. Walter Lowe turned away from the flight line, the smell of hydraulic fluid and salt air lingering on his skin one last time. The war was over. and the hunters of the dark could finally step out of the shadows. The Snoopers had fulfilled their duty, and as the Pacific wind blew through the empty hangars of Okinawa, the only sound left was the quiet, rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore, a sea that had finally stopped taking.